Hello and welcome to Say Hi to the Future, Ingenious Thinkers, a podcast aimed at highlighting the human side of ingenuity. My name is Ken Tenser, curator of Say Hi to the Future, helping leaders think differently in the face of uncertainty and ambiguity. Better thinking, better outcomes. With me today is Kim Crowder, CEO and founder of Kim Crowder Consulting, an organization partnering with companies using data to embed equity into their workplace culture, systems, processes, and leadership. Like this video if you enjoy our show, and subscribe to our channel. Leave us a comment with who we should interview next. Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you enjoy the show. Kim Crowder, welcome to Say Hi to the Future.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So Kim, one of the things that I read, it's quite spectacular in the sense of Forbes top 7 anti-racist educator. I mean, one, it's Forbes, but it's so hyper specific. How do you become that? How do you become known for an anti-racist education or educator?
Yeah, that's a good question. First it's having someone who is very kind be at Forbes, right? Janice Gassam has done several articles with me included, and Janice made that list. So having someone who not only is kind enough to add you to a list, but also has been watching you for a little while. So Janice watched me for a little while based on LinkedIn and other social media, and that's it. Really, there's no magic to that one. That's how it happened.
And so tell us a bit about your path, though, because that's a pretty strong and important platform to own or to be a part of. How do you get there?
When you ask about this path to being an anti-racist educator, I want to make sure that I always talk about the fact that my team and I actually focus on courageous leadership as part of the work that we do. And so when we think about courageous leadership, part of that is being able to be self-aware. And it's also to make sure, right, that a great leader sees everyone at an equitable place, right? And understanding the specific challenges of team members with specific backgrounds. As a leader, what does that mean for me? How do I communicate? How do I interact with someone based on culture, but also based on my own identity, how my identity shows up in the world? How do I need to maybe change the way that I lead with certain team members based on that? And so when we start to think about that, what I'm getting down to is that being anti-racist, being inclusive really are the key cornerstones of leadership. Now, the truth of the matter is that we have not been taught that, right? It has not been required as a core competency of a core value of a core characteristic of leaders. And so what we're finding, especially as we're moving into the future, you start talking about Gen Zs, you talk about millennials, the expectation is that for the future, that is what leadership is. And so what I'm excited about is the trajectory of that. So when you ask me, how do you get here? You get here, well, one, I'm a Black woman, right? That's clear. For those of you all who are watching, I am a Black woman. So I'm always thinking about this based on how it impacts me, but also based on how it impacts other groups, including the group that we often say has the most power, right? White people, because it does impact white people when we look at certain things. And so what I'm getting at across the board is I don't want to separate actually anti-racism from leadership or being inclusive from leadership. We can't separate the two. They are one and the same, and great leaders, right? Great leaders understand that.
So Kim, I love what you said. And one of the things you said off the top was we weren't taught this. And I think that's really critical. I mean, as you can see, I'm a nearly 6-year-old white male. I have 3 kids and 3 stepkids with different gender identities. And the reality is I wasn't taught this. So at the beginning, when they were teenagers, maybe they were a little bit critical of me if I said something wrong, but now they've morphed into mid to late 20s where they are helping me understand what I might say or do that is no longer acceptable. And I'm not saying or doing it because I I believe I'm a bad person. It's just I wasn't taught it. So I think that is so critical to say that, yeah, I don't know what the numbers are, but I'll say many or most of the people I've met just need to learn as I have about different genders, about different races, about how we're supposed to treat one another or speak to one another.
One of the things that first, let me just say, is that you are willing to learn from a different generation. To me, that is a key superpower of a strong leader, right? The ability to learn, because part of this is also generational. It's cross-generational, being able to communicate with people across generations. And so what I love is that you're willing to learn from a generation that is younger than you. One of the things that we see when we talk about mentoring in workplaces is that oftentimes leaders or folks who raise their hand and say, hey, I will be a mentor, don't get any training.
Right.
There's no academic or research as part of what makes a mentorship program strong, right? People just say, raise your hand, volunteer if you want to be a mentor, let's go, right? Instead of thinking about, is the person qualified to mentor someone? Because typically it's going to be intergenerational. Are they qualified to do that? Are they willing to learn and share based on generational differences? Can they lead cross-racially? Can they lead cross-gender in a cross-gender environment, right? And so all of these are key points around what you're saying, right? Because what we're finding is that this younger generation is more outspoken than ever, which I actually love, and is also open to the learning that's necessary. What we're seeing right now, particularly with educators, is that they're having to have a very different relationship with their students, because students now are raising their hand and saying, hey, actually, that's not quite right. Or I read this. Here's what I know about the history and what was going on over here. Like asking these more critical thinking questions. And saying, hey, what's the answer here? Or have you thought about it? Can we discuss this? And so great leaders are willing to have that open dialogue, that open conversation. I like to call it a feedback loop, right? Where that feedback is going in, it's coming back. And that really strong leaders are able to be self-aware and to course correct when necessary, including apologizing if necessary around something that was said, and then doing what it takes to move forward and get better.
Well, no, that's right. And I mean, you're talking about the willingness to learn. I go a little further with myself. I push myself a little more. Like I'm not a lifetime professor, but I've started to teach at different colleges and universities. And one of the courses that I chose to teach this summer was leadership, and it was a graduate course in leadership, and every single one of the people were international students who had recently moved to Canada, and they came for this 14-month post-grad certificate. And I, past willingness, I just found it fascinating. I mean, it was Asia, South Asia, Africa, China. I mean, it was just cultures that many of them have never been outside of their culture. And I had never been in contact with people who had just moved over. So in that type of density, I mean. So finding ways to just test yourself, I think it's awesome. And frankly, that didn't happen 30, 40 years ago. Profs didn't have that opportunity.
Yeah, even when you think about that, Ken, think about an example that you shared in that classroom that didn't land with everyone.
Yeah.
Did you have a moment like that? Of course you did. Right?
Yes.
Many,
Yes, I did.
many. And so even in that, that is a part of the conversation, is how do we communicate across cultures? Now more than ever, our workplaces are more dynamic. That's exciting. People are working hybrid. People are working all over the globe. And then we take these folks and cross them over, whether it be time difference, whether it be through language and different cultures. And what we don't do is provide a bridge. Right? Even for our leaders to be able to demonstrate that to other folks. Let's say maybe we can't necessarily provide this bridge for every single person, but do we have leaders who can guide in that conversation? I specifically think about mergers and acquisitions. This is now we're getting a little nerdy, right? But when we think about mergers and acquisitions, often there is a merger of companies. Actually, I was just talking to an oil and gas company, and the merger was happening. One, time difference was a big one, but it was also culture, right? And geographically different, right? You have a culture that's across the world. You have another culture that's in the United States. And they were having, what we see with M&As is that many of them failed. The bulk fail, I think about 70%, because of culture. And the cultural differences, and the inability sometimes for leaders to have the tools and the skill set, not because they can't do it, but because they haven't honed that around how to create the environment so that those cultures melt together. And that's not just, I'm talking, now I'm talking about geographical, but that's not even just that. It can even be cultures even within the United States, right? If a company, the headquarters is built on a culture in New York City versus a culture in Austin, Texas, right? That could be very different, just the baseline values of those cultures. And so having leaders in place who can guide and lead around those cultures, who can decide clearly what our values are, how do we take those values and take the best of both worlds, and then over time, because it takes more than just like one take, right? Can we talk about those examples that you had? I'm sure you've had to do that over and over with those students where you're like, oh, that example didn't stick. And that happens every once in a while when you least expect it, right? Where you're like, oh, we're here again. And so it takes practice, is what I'm getting at. It takes practice. It takes doing it over and over. And again, it's just not a skill set that we have honed or worked with leaders on for the long term. And it's more important than ever, as I mentioned, as workplaces become more dynamic, as they become more global, as they become more intergenerational, where the expectation is that leaders know how to navigate that. And so we've got to start planning now to provide leaders with the tools necessary in order to do so.
So let's talk a little bit about the tools, because one of the things, whether I'm working with CEOs or the students, I mean, everybody always says, okay, look at the future, prepare for the future, do whatever, but they never tell you how. And a lot of my life, a lot of my practice is helping people recognize the macro trends, a shift of which obviously the changing face of culture and leadership is one of them. And I like to tell them how or where to start. So, I mean, you founded Kim Crowder Consulting. I'm guessing, I'm hoping that you are telling them a little bit about the how or where to start. I mean, can you share some of that with us?
Yeah, I like that question. Thank you. When we start to think about the how, some of that is, the biggest thing is understanding where your workplace is in that moment in time, right? If we could freeze a frame, where is your organization in that moment in time? And what I mean by that is who are your leaders? Who do they think they are? Who do your team members think they are? Who do your team members wish they were?
Okay.
Like really. So now we have these four components that often may be very different. What's interesting is, have you ever said something about yourself and then maybe somebody who knows you deeply looks at you and goes, do you really believe that about yourself? Because that's not true, right? Because sometimes we need someone else to hold a mirror up for us so that we can truly understand. And also what we know is that from that C-suite, that executive place throughout the organization, that experiences change. right? Those experiences are very different. And that could even be down to who's working in those corporate offices, based, who's working in the factory or manufacturing or that sort of thing, right? Across the board, those experiences can be different, as can be the abilities and the skill sets for those leaders. They may need different skill sets, but they also may have been given or poured into more based on who they lead. And so when we think about that, the goal is for us to take that and flatten it, so that everyone has the same information, the same opportunities, the same requirements, so that across the board, team members are experiencing the workplace in ways that are the same no matter where they sit in the organization. Where we see this really have an impact is when we start to look at retention, particularly the desire to retain top talent, or when we take a look at who's leaving the organization. That's a really strong indicator. Are there certain groups of folks who are leaving on a more regular basis than other folks? Are they leaving from a certain business unit and a department? And so all of those are clues, right? We like to call them clues, right? Of who the organization is, what the values of the organization are. And what happens is once you can put that into words and you can create language and a framework for everyone, for all of your leaders to not only learn from, you start thinking about bringing in new people in the organization or moving people forward around promotions and moving them into leadership, then they understand what is required of them. They get to decide whether or not they connect with those values, if they can be the best fit for the organization, as does your organization on the other side of it. So what I'm getting at is it's not just at baseline a leadership function, it expands beyond that. And the more that we can communicate that openly, the more that everyone feels really good about this relationship. If an organization has the same values as me in action, they live that, why would I want to leave that organization, right? It fits me. We're a great fit for each other. And I'm not talking about this cultural fit thing. I'm talking about values. And then knowing, do our values need to shape and change? Are they stagnant? Do we need to move that forward? So really it is a good indicator for how impactful is your organization going to be for the future. Right? Is your organization ready to be impactful because I believe the landscape of work is going to change tremendously in the next 5 years, right? It has already changed since COVID. You think about COVID and how much work has changed after COVID, and companies are, keep trying to pull people back into it, and people are going, no, I'm not going back to what it was. We love this new place. And so for organizations that are thinking about not only the current, but also in the next 5 years, where do we want to be? Who do we want to retain in our organization? Who do we want to attract? This is a good way to get there.
So Kim, as you go through that, I understand all of it. To me, there's a huge leap, and you speak to empathy and vulnerability. So a huge leap that a leader must make. And my dad passed a number of years ago. I was writing my second book. It was on entrepreneurship, which is engaging next gen thinking into innovation, into the organization. And you know what? He was a great guy and a super successful entrepreneur, but from a different era. He passed very old. So when I told him about it, he said to me, "But I don't understand. Isn't it your company? Why are you doing this?" And he didn't say it in a bad way. He just said it in a truly, "What are you doing?" Kind of way. So as a leader, as an owner, vulnerability, empathy, the position you put yourself in and making this leap, that's huge.
I believe it is. And I also believe that when we start talking about things like empathy and vulnerability, that those are not measurable. Okay. Specifically in the way that what we call empathy and what we call vulnerability can be very different based on your background, right? Your ability to have empathy for someone else based on their experiences can be very different if your experiences have never been that. I'll give you just an easy example. If you have never been someone who has been food insecure, or who has lived in a place where food was not easily available, or grown up and not had a car and used public transportation. Like, all of these are ways that provide us the ability to pull from something. All empathy is basically putting yourself to some degree in someone else's shoes, and then saying, I understand what that feels like. I can walk alongside you based on my understanding of what that feels like. But the truth of the matter is that sometimes we don't have that. We don't have that memory or that feeling to draw from. And so I really like to talk about this behaviorally as well. What are the behaviors necessary? What's the learning necessary that I need? What's the unlearning as a leader? Because, a lot of this, I believe, is a lot of unlearning to be able to get me to a place so that I can lead XYZ. I can lead my company, no matter XYZ, what their backgrounds are, in a way that is human. That is humanistic forward, right? That it is human centered. And so I do believe that empathy and vulnerability are great. I also believe that without definition and without demonstration, that people are going to have wildly different thoughts about that. And then vulnerability is an interesting one, because when you come from a historically ignored background, whether you are a woman, whether you are someone who's been racialized, the level of vulnerability that you can be in that workplace it matches whether or not you feel safe in that workplace, whether that workplace is safe. And so if I know that this workplace is not safe for me, the ask for me to be vulnerable is an invalid ask. I know better, right? Based on my experiences. So all of this, right, is a part of a really big conversation around what do we do to create those environments if we want X outcome, right? This is my Lean Six Sigma. When I'm I think, okay, here's the problem. Now, how do we solve for it? And so organizations that are really clear on what the challenges are and then begin solving for them around, leadership and how to lead so that can happen is really powerful.
When you talk about empathy and vulnerability and you discussed it that way, I'll take a step back in our conversation. We talked a little bit about next generation. I think the next generation is perfectly situated to become the most empathetic generation ever. And I believe that because they were the first generation, and again, I watch my kids who they could connect with anybody, anywhere in the world, at any time of day, and converse about any subject. And obviously, yes, I monitored who they were. They wanted to listen to a social media. Were you a good or bad dad? That's not the point of my comment. The point is that I didn't have a chance to speak to people on different continents when I was 15, 16, 20 years old. I just didn't. And they come into the workplace with an amazing if they choose, an amazing understanding of different cultures, different people, different challenges. And for me, it's helping older leaders, if you will. I'll call them more mature leaders or experienced. That this next generation really has the opportunity to be breakthrough.
I would agree with that, and I'll take my dad as an example. He'll love this. And so, when I was a child, I grew up in Houston, Texas. Houston, Texas is one of the most diverse cities in the United States. People don't always know that. Lots of folks who are first generation, so their parents maybe are expats from somewhere else, and they come and so a lot of that is the background of what's happening in Houston, Texas. My parents then moved us to Korea. So we lived in Seoul, Korea. And my father has since lived in a tremendous amount of countries. My father speaks multiple languages. He currently splits his time between the US and another country. And so when we think about it that way, that it can be developed. Now, what you're talking about, Ken, is the invention of www dot blah 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 blah, yeah. Right? You're talking about the internet coming into play. And then when you start to think about the timeline of people and when people may have had access to more information and how that happened, it is very different, right? When you travel, right? My father's generation had to travel. That was the only way that could really get done to a large degree, is to take your body there. The difference now is we don't have to take our bodies there. Our minds go there often. And that's not even, we were doing like chat rooms back in the day, or emails. Now I can just pick up my phone right now, and on social media or on news stations or on a podcast, now I have access to a world's worth of knowledge. And so that's what we're seeing with the younger generation. And so I'm almost like putting it into these boxes around how people learn about other cultures, how people become educated if they so choose. As you mentioned, I do believe that this generation has the most, the quickest access to that in ways that we did not. And because of that, they are filtering so much of what's happening in the world based on empathy. I do believe that sometimes it can be an overload. It certainly can be. For me. We are finding that this generation is so deeply engrossed in social media. That'll be interesting to watch over time, what the impacts of that is. I do agree with you that now the world is available with your fingertips. I have meetings with people all the time in other countries like this. And it's easy. It's just here's a Zoom link. You can just hop on, right? And so we're living in a very different world for many of us than what we grew up in. And it's quite fascinating. So watching this generation have access is amazing. And also, I don't want to exclude nor excuse older generations or make the assumptions that they themselves don't have access or did not have access as well. Reading books is another great way. Yeah. So there's a lot of ways that we can get there, but you are very much so correct in that this younger generation can literally pick up this phone and all of a sudden the world is open and available.
Kim, it's amazing how quickly time goes, especially with this conversation, and our time's coming to an end here this morning on Say Hi to the Future, and we spend it with Kim Crowder. Kim, one last question. I'm going to pull another quote of yours. So I started with an accolade, and I'm going to go to a quote. Diversity, equity, inclusion, and anti-racism should be embedded into the DNA of organizations in a fully realized way. When you hear that quote, share with the viewers and the listeners, what's a success story? Where have you embedded it in the DNA? And just give us some example of, we've had a wonderful conversation, but what do we do tomorrow morning at 7 a.m.?
I love that. One of the organizations and I've talked about them on social media, we actually did some work with them based on the main output of what their department did is around branding and marketing and communications. And so we worked with them on building that into the ways that they think about communicating to their external audiences. This is a university, or a department that's a university. It starts there, but what we saw was a shift in the ways that their leaders were thinking about the workplace in general. Who's making decisions? What are the processes? What are the processes that we have in place so that people, if they see something, are able to raise their hand? Are they safe to do that? Because it really cannot happen, Ken, in a vacuum, right? Where we see this be most powerful are for those leaders who are willing to do three things. One is be flexible. Mm-hmm. Is this a leader that's willing to pivot where necessary? Is this a leader who gives the ability to raise their hand and to make changes to team members? So that's one, right? That flexibility. The second one is that self-awareness. This is a white man who said, you know what? The truth of the matter is that we can, there's some ways that we can really expand, particularly around inclusion at this level. So being self-aware enough to be able to say that out loud is deeply important. And then that third thing is to really create decision-making almost in a committee-like way. And so they have a committee that's specifically focused on inclusion, and that committee gets together based on who volunteers, who wants to be a part of it. They made sure that everyone in that business unit was given skill set and tools needed through facilitations and learning with Kim Crowder Consulting, and then able to take that and give their team members the necessary tools so that they can make those decisions. And so, those really are the three things: that flexibility, that ability to be self-aware, and then that third one is to be open to making those decisions in community and getting your team members educated where necessary, particularly your leaders and decision makers, around what is necessary in order to move the organization forward. And so those are the three things that we have seen be consistently powerful for organizations. We see this in another nonprofit we're working with as well. And so the more willingness that leaders have to maybe unlearning, I'm authoritarian, I make the decision from here, and saying, oh, wait, let me back up. How do I make these decisions so that team members feel, not only feel involved, but are involved in action, that we, take those suggestions and make changes, and that our team members watch us do the messy process of that. We communicate that we're open. You'd be surprised how many team members actually respect that process, as opposed to saying it and not doing it. That's where we see the murkiness, where team members start to distrust an organization, is when they don't see movement, when they don't see change. And then they start to back away when when that's not being communicated. Here's the change we're trying to make based on what we learned, you shared. Here's what that's going to look like. We may not get it perfectly. That being able to be vulnerable, right? That's a vulnerable communication. And so now you win points, right? You have that vulnerability, you win points. Your team members trust you and watch you move forward. And now that relationship is symbiotic, instead of sort of fractured, right? Where team members see one picture, but then the outcome is not the same. And so is that the word, symbiotic? There's a word. I find that when we start to talk about vulnerability and behavior, where you were going, how does that language look like? What does that look like in action? Those are ways what that looks like in leadership in action.
Kim Crowder Consulting, thank you so much. What a wonderful and powerfully important conversation. And thanks for sharing it with us at Say Hi to the Future.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.